Alright, so if you're missing class on Wednesday, this would be the lesson that you need to watch. This is Triangle Proofs Day 3. Alright, so this should go a little bit faster since we don't need to stop as much. But do me a favor as we go through this, if there's anything that I'd say that you need to stop and try on your own, please pause it, try it on your own before you just listen to me go through it. Okay, so in this warm-up, you're going to need to find a blank page somewhere back your calendar, something like that. So pause it, find a blank page. But let's see if you remember some rules with algebra. So if we have that the measure of angle 1 is 2x plus 5, so that's this one right here is 2x plus 5. And then the measure of angle 3 over here is 8x minus 7. Let's see what we can find. Alright, so we actually haven't done one too much like this before. So this angle 3 right here, if you notice as I trace over it, it's actually vertical to this angle right here. All the way from here to here is congruent from here to here. So that means that the expression 8x minus 7 is actually equal to this 90-degree angle for angle 5 plus this angle of angle 1, 2x plus 5. So if I combine like terms, I get 2x plus 95. Subtract 2x, I get 6x. Add 7, I get 102. And if I divide both sides by 6, I get that x equals 17. So x is 17. If I substitute back in over here and I do 8 times 17 minus 7, I get that this angle, the measure of angle 3, is 129 degrees. I already know that the measure of angle 5 is 90. And I can find the measure of angle 1 by doing 2 times 17 plus 5. And I get 39 degrees. Okay. I can figure out the measure of angle 2 because measure of angle 3 and 2 are a linear pair. So I can do 180 minus the measure of angle 3, which is 129. So that means that the measure of angle 2 is 51 degrees. And notice that 2 and 4 are vertical, so that means that the measure of angle 4 also has to be 51 degrees. Alright, so take a chance, take a look back at it if you need to. Otherwise, let's move on. There's your homework. If you have homework questions, make sure you come in and see me since you're not there to ask anything. Okay, so we're going to do a third day of triangle proofs, which just means more practice with proving triangles congruent and then proving other pieces congruent using CPCTC. So first things first, some of the reasons that we used have been vertical angles. So if we have vertical angles, then that means that we know that the angles are congruent. So if vertical angles, then angles are congruent. If two segments are perpendicular, that means that where they intersect, they make a 90-degree angle. So if two segments are perpendicular, then angles are 90 degrees, and if they're both 90 degrees, then they're congruent. So they're 90 degrees and congruent. So what that means is if you have this segment and this segment being perpendicular, it means that this angle is 90 and that angle is 90, which then means if they're both 90, they're congruent. Okay? So why don't you pause this and write down the given and then label your diagram with the given that you have. Okay, so our goal is to prove that the triangles are congruent. So we're actually not going to use CPCTC at all, because that's always the step after proving triangles congruent. So in order to prove triangles congruent, I need 3 congruent statements. I so far have 1 and I have 2. I need to get 1 more. And if I take a look at what I've labeled on my diagram, I can actually see that these are vertical angles, which means they're congruent. Make sure that you do not say angle A for these, but actually use 3 letters. So I'm going to call this angle BAE. So angle BAE, notice A is the middle letter, is congruent to angle RAS. And the reason, if vertical angles, then congruent. That's a pretty popular one to use. I now have 1, 2, 3 things congruent, so now I can state my triangles are congruent, and I'm just going to write exactly what they told me to prove. So triangle BEA is congruent to triangle SRA. And the reason that I can say they are congruent is if I look back here, I have an angle, and then a side. Notice the side's not between the angle. So my reason is angle, angle, side. I had an angle congruent in step 1, I had another angle congruent in step 2, and I had a side congruent in step 1. So I actually did state all 3 of them, so I'm good. There's my proof. Okay. If you need to pause it, you can go back up. Otherwise, why don't you write down what's in example 2. Okay, so in this one, I want to prove triangles congruent as well, which means I, again, will not need to use CPCTC, so that's an extra step I don't need to do. I've already labeled in there that HA is congruent to WA in my diagram, but I need to do something with this statement. I need to figure out how I can get a congruent statement out of it. So if KA, right here, this segment, is perpendicular to HW, that means that right here when they intersect, that means that they form two 90-degree angles. So they form a 90-degree angle here, and if they're both 90, then they must be congruent. So I want to actually state that those two angles are congruent. So I want to say, and I don't want to say again angle A, I want to say angle HAK is congruent to angle WAK. And the reason I can say that they're congruent is if perpendicular, then actually we're just going to say then 90 degrees. So we're going to say then 90 degrees and congruent. So meaning if they're perpendicular, then the angles are 90 degrees, which then in the degrees means angles, and then that means that they're congruent, which allows me to say that. So that's 2 congruent statements. I still need one more. My step 3, if you take a look back at your triangle, I've used all of my given now, but if I look at my triangle, I can see that I can state that segment's congruent. So I can say segment AK is congruent to segment AK. Okay, and then my reason is make sure you say reflexive and you say property as well. So reflexive property. I now count my congruent statements 1, 2, 3, which means my next logical step is to say that triangle HAK is congruent to triangle WAK from this right here. And I look back at my triangle to figure out what postulate I just used, and I can see that I have a side, an angle, and a side, and the angle is in fact between my sides. So SAS, I look to see, make sure that I actually did state 3 things. I have a side in step 1, I have an angle in step 2, and then in step 3 another side. Okay, and these two could be flip-flop, number 2 and 3, but number 1 and 4 have to be in that order. Alright, so take a look at that if you need to. And then when you are done, flip over to the next page. And then why don't you try starting this one by yourself. Do the given, see if you can get through the entire thing. If you can't, then unpause it and then try it, or listen to me. Okay, so the nice thing about this proof is that we gave you 2 congruent statements. However, we are asking you to prove something other than triangles. But the only way that I'm going to be able to prove that angle E and H are congruent is to first prove that this triangle is congruent to this triangle. Because if those triangles are congruent, those are corresponding parts, and then they must also be congruent. So I must first prove the triangle is congruent, which means I need 3 statements. I already have 2, so I take a look at my triangle, and hopefully you guys are starting to get used to seeing this. These are vertical angles. Again, don't say angle F, so I'm going to use 3 letters. I'm going to say angle DFE is congruent to angle GFH. And then again, if then, so if vertical angles, then congruent. I now have 1, 2, 3 statements, so my next logical statement is to state the triangles, which you can do in a number of different ways. I typically like to start with the vertical angle, so I'm going to say triangle F, and then I'm going to go out to this angle that I know is congruent, so F, D, E, and because of the way I chose those three, I then have to say triangle F, I have to go out to G, and then to H. And my reason, if I look at what I have an angle, a side, in between the angles. So I have to say angle, side, angle. And just to check and make sure, I have an angle in step 1, a side in step 1, and then an angle in step 2. So I actually did state 3 different congruent statements. So because I finally stated my triangles congruent, my next logical step is to always, after proving triangles, use CP/CTC. So I can now say angle E is congruent to angle H, which is what I wanted to state. And because I know the triangles are congruent, their corresponding parts must be congruent. So CP/CTC. So 4 steps. Okay, so take a look back at that if you need to. And then go ahead and pause this and try to do number 4 again on your own. Alright, hopefully you're just checking your answers here. But if I want to go through this, I have 2 congruent statements. I need to prove segments congruent, which means before I can do that, I need to prove that this triangle is congruent to this triangle. So here's one of the triangles that I need to prove congruent to this triangle. I only need one more congruent statement, and hopefully you see right here that it is the reflexive property. So I'm going to say that segment JL is congruent to segment JL, and then the reason is the reflexive property. Sorry if my handwriting's bad, it's hard to write on this. Okay, I now have 1, 2, 3 things congruent, so the next logical thing to do is to prove that the triangles are congruent. Again, a lot of ways that you can do this. I'm going to start with the 1 tick mark here, and I'm going to say triangle J, and then I'm going to go down to the 2 tick marks, and I'm going to say K, and I'm going to finish with L is congruent to triangle, and then I need to do the same thing. So 1 tick mark is L, 2 is M, and then finish off with J. And if I take a look at my triangles here, I have 2 angles and a side, but the side is not between, the side is not between the angles, so that means it has to be an angle, and then a side. I have both angles in step 1, and then my side in step 2. Alright, and then lastly, I now prove my triangle is congruent, so the next logical step is to use CP/CTC. So segment KJ is congruent to segment ML, and the reason after I prove triangles congruent will always be CP/CTC, which is why we prove triangles congruent. Okay, so one more proof. Again, try to do this one on your own. Pause it, try it, and then check your answer. Okay, so I'm only given one congruent statement. I am asked to prove that angles are congruent, which means I first have to prove triangles congruent. So hopefully we're starting to get used to that process. Okay, so I already know that these angles are congruent. I need to figure out how to use this statement right here in order to figure out a congruent statement. So they're trying to help me find one. Let's see if we can find it. So if segment RT is perpendicular to segment AS, that means right where they hit, they formed 2 90-degree angles. Sorry. So right there, 90 degrees, and if they're both 90 degrees, then that means that they're the same and they're congruent. So that means I can say angle ATR is congruent to angle STR. And my reason is kind of lengthy, but if perpendicular, then 90 degrees and congruent. So same way that we said it before. So if 2 segments are perpendicular, then the angles are 90 degrees, which means then they're the same and they're congruent. It's kind of a lot, but alright, so now I have 1, 2 things, and then hopefully you see that the next thing right there is the reflexive property. So I'm going to say segment RT is congruent to segment RT. And then my reason is the reflexive property. Hopefully you guys are seeing that reflexive property and vertical angles are your two most common. Alright, I now have 1, 2, 3 things congruent, so my next logical step is to state my triangles are congruent. So I want to state triangle RAT right here. So triangle RAT is congruent to triangle RST. Right there. So triangle RST. And my reason is I have two angles and a side, and the angle is between them. So a side, an angle, and a side. And let's see where those came from. So a side came from, let's see. Oops, sorry, that is not side, angle, side. This would be an angle, side, and an angle. Angle, side, angle. An angle came from step 1, a side came from step 3, and an angle came from step 2. And then after I state triangles congruent, because that's not what they asked me to do, the next logical step is to use CP, CT, So I can now say that angle A is congruent to angle S. This angle is congruent to this angle. Because if the triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent. CP, CT. Okay? So if you need to look back at this and rewrite down anything, feel free. Otherwise, we'll skip that. Your homework is to complete the worksheet that's day 3. It looks like this. Alright, it's front and back, so that's the front page, and then that's the back page. And then the answers are online for you to check. If you have any questions, come in and see me. Otherwise, Thursday we talk about a perpendicular bisector. And that's the last lesson. Alright, thank you.